In the quiet corners of the medieval world, where candlelight flickered against stone walls and the sounds of the village slowly faded into silence, sleep was never as simple as closing one's eyes. To us, sleep might seem universal, a natural rhythm that requires little thought. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was shaped by belief, necessity, and custom, woven deeply into the daily struggles and hopes of people who lived centuries ago. To fall asleep in that era was not just a personal act of rest but also a reflection of society itself. For most peasants, who made up the majority of the population, sleep was dictated by the sun and the demands of labor. The day began at dawn, often long before the sun fully rose. Sleep came in cycles, not always in one solid block. Historians have uncovered references to what is called segmented sleep. People often fell into slumber soon after dusk, only to wake again in the middle of the night, somewhere between midnight and early morning. This period of wakefulness was considered natural. Families might talk quietly, tend to small chores, or even pray during these hours before returning to bed for what was known as the second sleep. It is a practice almost forgotten today, replaced by a modern expectation of continuous rest. Imagine a family huddled together on a rough bed stuffed with straw, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke, livestock nearby, and the muffled creak of timbers in the dark. The father might stir in the middle of the night, rise to check the fire, and perhaps exchange a few whispered words with his wife. Children might murmur in their sleep. Outside, silence blanketed the fields, but sometimes, the bark of a dog or the distant sound of a night traveler reminded them that the world still stirred. These moments of wakefulness were not seen as disturbances, they were part of life's rhythm. People sometimes used this time to reflect, to pray for blessings, or even to engage in conversations too private or delicate for the light of day. For those of higher social status, sleep took place in somewhat greater comfort, though still governed by similar rhythms. Nobles and the wealthy had chambers with heavy drapes to block drafts, and feather mattresses instead of straw. Servants often slept nearby, ready to respond to needs in the middle of the night. Yet even in these halls of privilege, segmented sleep was common. The first sleep was deep and restorative, followed by an interval of wakefulness, then the second sleep leading into the dawn. This pattern was so accepted that it was referenced in medical texts and religious writings, as though it was as natural as breathing. Religious life profoundly shaped the rhythms of sleep. Monks, bound by the rules of their orders, often rose at specific hours of the night to chant prayers. The ringing of bells might wake them from their beds, drawing them to dimly lit chapels where psalms echoed softly against stone. Sleep, for them, was intertwined with devotion. Interruptions were not flaws but sacred opportunities to give part of the night to God. In towns and villages, parish churches sometimes rang bells at intervals too, marking hours of prayer, subtly influencing the ways common folk thought about time and sleep. Another aspect of medieval sleep was the communal nature of resting spaces. Privacy, as we think of it today, was rare. Families shared beds, and travelers often shared space with strangers at inns or hospices. The bed was a place of intimacy but also necessity. To share warmth was practical, especially in cold climates. To lie beside another person, sometimes friend, sometimes stranger, was not always a choice but often an expectation. This closeness brought comfort but also unease, as bed sharing could blur lines of propriety. Yet it was the norm, and people grew accustomed to it. The setting of sleep, too, varied by circumstance. In cities, cramped quarters often meant multiple family members and even servants sleeping in the same room. In rural areas, cottages might consist of a single large space where people and animals alike shared warmth during harsh winters. Wealthier households, by contrast, had separate chambers and beds hung with curtains, offering not only warmth but also a degree of seclusion. These curtains served as shields against drafts but also as barriers against watching eyes, creating small pockets of privacy in otherwise communal lives. And beyond the home, sleep was not always secure. Night carried dangers. Roads were unsafe, villages vulnerable to bandits, and towns dimly lit. To lie down to sleep was, in a sense, to surrender oneself to the unknown. Many prayers before bed carried tones of protection, asking for safety through the hours of darkness. The idea of sleep as a vulnerable state was deeply ingrained. People feared not only earthly threats but also spiritual ones. Nightmares were thought to be more than tricks of the mind, they were sometimes interpreted as signs, warnings, or even visitations from darker forces. Thus, bedtime routines often blended the practical with the spiritual. A peasant might secure the door and check the fire before reciting a prayer for safe rest. A noble might retire to a chamber lit by candles, say evening prayers, and lie down beneath embroidered covers. Monks closed their eyes only to rise again when bells demanded it. Across all walks of life, sleep carried meanings beyond rest. It was a meeting place of body, spirit, and society. If the rhythm of segmented sleep shaped the nightly lives of ordinary people, the practice of bed sharing defined their sense of closeness and community. In today's world, the idea of lying down beside strangers might seem strange or uncomfortable, but in the Middle Ages, it was a matter of necessity and, at times, survival. Inns were common resting points for travelers, but they were not the private spaces we imagine today. A single bed could be shared by 2, 3, or even more individuals. A weary merchant arriving after sunset might find himself lying beside a farmer, a pilgrim, or a soldier on the road. The sharing of beds blurred lines of status and identity. It was the bed itself, not the individual, that mattered most. Warmth was precious, and so was space. The night could be cold, and the comforts of companionship outweighed the awkwardness of intimacy with strangers. Even within households, communal sleeping was expected. Families often gathered together, children nestled beside parents, siblings huddled close. It was not uncommon for servants to sleep in the same room as their masters, sometimes even within the same bed, especially if warmth was scarce. The concept of privacy was foreign in such settings. The home was a shared environment, and the night was not seen as a time to isolate but as a time to gather. This closeness did not always bring comfort. There were concerns about propriety, particularly regarding bed sharing between unrelated men and women. Medieval texts sometimes cautioned against immoral behavior that could arise in shared beds. Still, necessity often won over social unease. The physical world demanded warmth, and sharing space was often the only way to endure cold nights. In many ways, these habits reveal the stark difference between medieval life and the modern world, where personal boundaries and privacy are fiercely guarded. The bed itself was more than a piece of furniture. In poorer homes, it was often nothing more than a sack filled with straw, laid on the ground or on wooden frames. These makeshift beds were far from comfortable, prone to pests and the smells of daily life. Yet they were precious. For wealthier families, the bed was a symbol of status and wealth. Great four-poster beds, draped with heavy curtains, not only offered warmth but also displayed prosperity. The bed was often the most expensive piece of furniture in a household, passed down as an heirloom through generations. Curtains around the bed served multiple purposes. They helped hold in warmth during long winters, shielded sleepers from drafts, and created a sense of enclosure that mimicked privacy in otherwise open rooms. For nobles, the heavy fabrics were embroidered with elaborate designs, often reflecting heraldic symbols or religious motifs. To step inside such a bed was to enter a personal sanctuary, closed off from the world, at least for a few hours of rest. The rituals surrounding bed sharing also carried symbolic weight. To invite someone into one's bed was not only an offer of comfort but often an extension of trust, hospitality, or alliance. Records show that kings, nobles, and even clergy sometimes shared beds, not for reasons of intimacy, but for practicality and even diplomacy. A shared bed was a place where bonds could be strengthened, secrets exchanged, and trust demonstrated. The simple act of lying down beside another person was, in its own way, political. Yet the communal nature of medieval sleep also brought its share of problems. Lice and fleas thrived in bedding, spreading easily when beds were shared. Illness could move swiftly through households, transmitted in the closeness of the night. Complaints about vermin in beds are scattered throughout medieval writings, from peasants to kings. For all the warmth and safety it provided, bed sharing also carried risks, a reality that people simply endured. Despite these hardships, the idea of solitude in sleep was alien to most medieval people. To lie alone was often considered unfortunate or even suspicious. The presence of others offered a sense of safety, comfort, and belonging. Darkness was a time of vulnerability, and to share it with others, even strangers, brought reassurance. In the stillness of the night, when the fire burned low and the world outside grew quiet, people found comfort in the rhythm of shared breath and the warmth of another body nearby. Sleep, then, was not only an individual act but a communal experience. It reflected the interconnectedness of medieval life, where survival often depended on community rather than individuality. The practice of sharing a bed reminds us that the medieval world was built on bonds, of necessity, of family, of society, that shaped even the most intimate moments of rest. While the communal nature of medieval sleep revealed much about the values of society, the differences between rich and poor could not be ignored. The contrast in how the two classes slept was often as stark as the difference between their daily lives. To study medieval sleep is to witness how wealth shaped comfort, safety, and even the meaning of rest. For peasants, the bed was rarely more than a crude arrangement. A mattress might be a sack of straw, sometimes mixed with herbs meant to mask smells or deter pests. These mattresses were thin, uncomfortable, and in constant need of refilling. They were laid directly on the floor or on rough wooden frames, creaking under the weight of a family. Pillows were luxuries few could afford. Instead, people often rested their heads on rolled-up cloaks or bundles of cloth. Blankets, too, were limited, with animal skins or coarse wool serving as covers during cold nights. Despite the discomfort, such arrangements were accepted as normal. Rest was functional, it gave strength for the next day's labor. The peasant's bed was not a place of indulgence but of necessity, and it reflected a life lived close to hardship. Sleep was survival, and comfort was secondary. For the wealthy, however, the bed was not only for sleep but also a stage for displaying power and status. In noble households, the bed was often the most expensive piece of furniture, elaborately carved from oak, adorned with fabrics imported from faraway lands. Feather mattresses replaced straw, and pillows stuffed with down provided softness unimaginable to peasants. Beds were raised high from the ground, sometimes so tall that small steps were needed to climb into them. Heavy curtains surrounded these beds, lined with silk or velvet, shutting out cold and prying eyes alike. To lie in such a bed was to be enveloped in a cocoon of luxury. The rich experienced a sense of seclusion, a private world where sleep was both restful and symbolic. Servants attended to the preparation of these beds, arranging sheets and blankets, sometimes even warming them before their masters entered. The act of going to sleep became a ritual of status, as important as the meal or the feast earlier in the day. The role of the bed extended beyond rest. In noble households, it was often the setting for important events. Births and deaths frequently occurred in beds, surrounded by family and attendants. It was in bed that a noble might receive guests or discuss affairs with trusted advisors, the bed functioning almost as a throne in the private chamber. In this way, the bed symbolized not only comfort but authority. Between the worlds of rich and poor lay the clergy, whose relationship with sleep was shaped by discipline and devotion. Monks often lived in dormitories, where rows of simple cots or pallets lined the walls. The emphasis was on equality and humility, with little regard for comfort. Sleep was functional, secondary to the greater purpose of prayer and service. Strict schedules dictated their lives, with the night broken by calls to rise for chants and vigils. In their world, sleep was not indulgence but obedience, another rhythm in the service of God. Women, too, experienced sleep differently depending on status. For peasant women, the bed was shared with children, often crowded and restless. For noble women, the bed was a guarded space, sometimes attended by handmaids who slept nearby. Privacy was relative, even in wealth, but the quality of rest varied greatly. The presence of rich linens and feathered beds made nights more bearable, while peasant women endured the discomfort of straw and the constant needs of children. Despite these differences, one common thread tied all classes together: the vulnerability of sleep. Whether on a bed of straw or beneath velvet curtains, all shared the awareness that sleep was both necessary and perilous. It was a time when defenses were lowered, when dangers, whether physical, like intruders, or spiritual, like nightmares, seemed closer. The wealthy might feel safer behind locked doors and heavy curtains, but fear of the unknown lingered even in their chambers. The contrast between rich and poor in sleep habits illustrates not only inequality but also the universality of rest. No matter the luxury or the hardship, sleep was essential, and all people, high and low, were united by the need to close their eyes against the darkness. The bed may have been different, the rituals varied, but the act of surrendering to night was shared by all. To understand sleep in the medieval world, one must also recognize that it was not seen as separate from the rhythms of daily life. Today, we imagine sleep as a private retreat, an isolated part of our schedule, cut off from work, meals, and prayer. But in the Middle Ages, sleep flowed naturally into the cycle of living, connected to everything from the fire that warmed the hearth to the bells that rang from the church tower. Evening in a medieval village was a gradual descent into darkness. Without modern lighting, daily activities followed the sun's path. Work slowed as daylight faded, and families gathered indoors, where candles or rushlights cast dim glows against walls. Preparation for sleep was not elaborate. A peasant might check that the fire was safe, secure the door, and gather with family on a shared mattress of straw. These small rituals created a rhythm that was both practical and protective. Night was a time of vulnerability, and to lie down without securing the home was unthinkable. For those in towns and cities, the fall of night carried additional meaning. Curfews were sometimes enforced, bells ringing to mark when streets should be cleared. To be outside after dark was often seen as suspicious, associated with crime or disorder. Sleep, then, was not only rest but also compliance with the order of society. Darkness was not to be wasted in wandering but to be respected, a boundary between the safety of home and the dangers beyond. Religious influence also permeated the structure of nightly rest. Prayers before bed were as common as meals. People recited familiar words, asking for protection from illness, spirits, or sudden death in the night. Sleep was understood as a small death, a temporary surrender of the senses, and so the invocation of divine guardianship was natural. Children were taught simple prayers before lying down, and adults often whispered pleas for mercy and safety. The connection between sleep and spirituality was intimate and constant. Dreams, too, carried weight in the medieval imagination. They were not dismissed as random visions of the mind but interpreted as messages, warnings, or even prophecies. Religious texts spoke of dreams as pathways to divine communication, while folk traditions viewed them as omens. A troubling dream might stir anxiety, prompting confession or prayer, while a hopeful dream could inspire confidence in the days ahead. Night was therefore not only a time of rest but also a time of revelation, when the veil between the earthly and spiritual world seemed thinner. In monasteries, the rhythm of sleep and prayer was strictly enforced. Monks rose at intervals through the night, summoned by bells to chant psalms. Their rest was interrupted, not as a hardship, but as a duty. To awaken from slumber and lift voices in prayer was to sanctify the night itself. In this way, sleep was not an obstacle but a tool, a cycle that shaped devotion. Their example influenced laypeople too, who often aligned their own routines with the sound of church bells marking hours in the dark. Practical concerns also shaped nightly habits. Fires were a constant risk, especially in towns where houses stood close together, built of wood and thatch. To let a fire burn unchecked while sleeping was dangerous, and so part of nightly routine involved banking the hearth, covering embers so they would smolder safely until morning. The glow of the fire offered reassurance, its warmth and light a comfort in the surrounding darkness. To drift to sleep with firelight flickering was part of the medieval experience, a shared memory across households rich and poor. The connection between sleep and daily labor was direct. Farmers rose with the dawn, often after broken nights of tending animals or protecting crops. Craftsmen in towns adjusted their hours according to available light. Nobles, less bound by labor, still followed the cycles of feast, prayer, and rest. Unlike today, when artificial light stretches the day and separates night from productivity, medieval people accepted night as a boundary. It was a time to slow, to reflect, to pray, and to surrender. Thus, sleep in the medieval world cannot be separated from life itself. It was woven into the fabric of existence, religion, labor, family, and community. To go to bed was not to step away from life but to continue it in another form, through prayer, dreams, and the comfort of shared rest. Night was not an interruption but part of the eternal cycle, a rhythm that bound medieval people together under the quiet watch of the stars. When we step back and look at the larger picture, medieval sleep appears not as a curiosity from the past, but as a window into the way people once lived, believed, and hoped. Sleep was not only a biological necessity but also a cultural act, one that revealed how people understood the world and their place within it. In the simple cottages of peasants, where straw beds were shared by entire families, sleep reflected the closeness of community and the struggle for survival. These nights were often restless, filled with the sounds of children shifting, animals nearby, and the crackle of a fire that needed tending. Yet in that closeness, there was also comfort. The shared breath of family, the warmth of bodies pressed together, and the security of knowing one was not alone in the dark gave sleep its own kind of peace. For the wealthy, sleep was more than rest. It was a declaration of status, an opportunity to retreat behind heavy curtains into a private world. Their beds were monuments of craftsmanship, symbols of wealth, and places where life's most significant moments unfolded. A noble might die in the same bed where his heirs were born, where alliances were forged in whispered conversations, where prayers were spoken at night's edge. The bed, in this sense, was not only furniture but a stage upon which the dramas of life and death played out. Religion wove itself into every layer of medieval sleep. From the bells that broke the night in monasteries to the whispered prayers of peasants before extinguishing the fire, sleep was framed as both a gift and a risk. To close one's eyes was to surrender to vulnerability, to risk dangers both earthly and spiritual. Yet it was also a time of trust, a trust in God, in family, in community. The night was dark, but it was watched over by faith, and this belief gave meaning to the hours of slumber. Dreams added another dimension. To dream was to cross into a realm that people believed could hold truth, warning, or revelation. Dreams might inspire, terrify, or console. They were remembered, retold, and sometimes even recorded, shaping decisions and guiding lives. In the silence of the night, the medieval sleeper was never entirely alone. The world of dreams connected him to something beyond, whether divine or mysterious. And always, sleep carried with it a sense of rhythm, of continuity. The practice of segmented sleep, 2 rests divided by a period of wakefulness, reminded people that night itself was alive, filled with possibilities. The hours between first and second sleep were times of reflection, prayer, intimacy, or quiet work. In those hushed moments, when the rest of the world seemed still, people found opportunities that daylight did not allow. In considering medieval sleep, we also glimpse the universality of the human experience. No matter how different their world may seem from ours, medieval people shared the same need for rest, the same vulnerability in the dark, and the same comfort in closeness. Their practices may appear strange to us now, yet beneath them lies a familiar truth. Sleep is both fragile and profound, a reminder of our humanity. As dawn crept across the horizon, villages stirred, nobles awoke behind their curtains, monks rose from their cots. Fires were rekindled, prayers whispered anew, and life began again. Sleep, with all its peculiarities, had carried them through the night and delivered them into the light of another day. And so the cycle continued, night after night, a rhythm as old as humanity itself. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture castles, battles, and knights in shining armor. Yet hidden within that world was something quieter, something as essential as food or water, the nightly act of sleep. To explore further into this subject is to uncover new layers of how medieval life was lived, how people balanced hardship with rest, and how their nights reflected not only their needs but also their fears, beliefs, and hopes. The medieval world did not have a uniform way of sleeping. Geography, climate, class, and custom all shaped the ways people rested. In colder regions, long winters encouraged families to sleep together for warmth, while in warmer areas, people might rest outside or near open windows. The diversity of practice was immense, but everywhere, sleep remained central to survival. It was as necessary as bread, and like bread, it was shaped by the hands of culture and tradition. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of medieval society, sleep was dictated by labor. The day began at dawn, sometimes earlier, with the crowing of roosters and the light creeping over fields. To sleep too long was to lose valuable time for work, and so the rhythm of their nights was never indulgent. First sleep began soon after darkness fell, broken later by a period of wakefulness, followed by second sleep before dawn. This segmented pattern, recorded in letters, diaries, and even legal documents, reveals that medieval nights were filled with activity. In those waking intervals, peasants prayed, repaired tools, tended to animals, or simply spoke with family. Night was not wasted time, it was another part of the working day, carried out in hushed tones and dim light. Among the nobility, sleep carried different meanings. While they also experienced segmented sleep, their surroundings and routines were shaped by wealth. Nobles lay in great beds with heavy curtains, designed not only for warmth but also for privacy. Servants might sleep nearby, on pallets or benches, ready to be called if needed. To be able to sleep without worry of theft or hunger was itself a privilege, one that marked the separation between classes. For them, the night was a space of comfort, though still filled with rituals of prayer and protection, for wealth did not shield them from fear of illness, spirits, or sudden death. Religious life continued to shape sleep in profound ways. Monasteries followed strict schedules, waking at intervals to chant prayers. The sound of bells echoing through the dark was familiar to all who lived nearby, a reminder that sleep itself was part of a larger spiritual rhythm. Even for those outside monastic walls, the influence was strong. Ordinary villagers often adjusted their routines according to the bells, marking time not only by the sun but also by the sacred sound that cut across the silence of night. In cities, sleep carried yet another layer of meaning. Darkness was considered dangerous. Curfews were enforced, with bells signaling when streets must be cleared. To be out after dark without reason could arouse suspicion, linking one to crime or unrest. As a result, sleep in urban settings was also tied to safety and order. The home became a sanctuary where families gathered together, locking out the uncertainties of the streets. Night was both rest and protection, a time to retreat from dangers both seen and unseen. Even as they lay down to rest, medieval people remained aware of the fragility of life. Infant mortality was high, illness struck without warning, and death often came suddenly. Bedtime prayers reflect this constant awareness. Simple words, repeated by generations, asked for protection of body and soul through the hours of darkness. To sleep was to risk never waking, and so each night carried with it both surrender and hope. Dreams deepened the significance of these hours. Rather than viewing dreams as mere fragments of the imagination, medieval people treated them as messages. Some were thought to come from God, others from the devil, and still others from the human soul itself. A dream could change decisions, alter relationships, or inspire action. Entire texts were devoted to dream interpretation, guiding people through the strange visions that visited them in sleep. Night, then, was a time when the boundary between the natural and the supernatural seemed porous, when sleepers felt they might glimpse truths hidden from waking life. And so, the first layer of understanding medieval sleep is to recognize its central role in both daily life and spiritual imagination. It was more than rest, it was safety, prayer, family, and revelation. To close one's eyes in the medieval world was to enter a space shaped by belief and necessity, by community and solitude, by fear and comfort. In that darkness, people found not only sleep but also meaning.